Yo, welcome to Write Better Stories. It's your host, DB. Today I'm going to talk about some shit. I don't even care. You might have noticed that I made a couple changes, but this is just me, whatever that is anyway. So, yeah, I guess we're going to talk about postmodernism and Buddhism or some shit like that. And it's probably stupid and dumb, and I don't even care. So, I can't carry that on for too long. Like I said, my name is Daniel Backer. Welcome to Write Better Stories. Today, I'm going to do something a little bit different by talking about some of the ideas that I got really excited about in college that I think still have an interesting hold on me today. And the idea that postmodernism and Buddhism can be very similar, but then can also, I think, be used to sustain cynical mindsets and attitudes that I have observed in myself, and then also in different people that I know. So I think that I will start out by talking about postmodernism and Buddhism, and then a little bit more about cynicism. And it's not necessarily my goal to explain that by learning more about these philosophies, they will necessarily make you cynical, but it's possible that if you have cynical tendencies anyway, you might find yourself gravitating toward these philosophies, or if you have a predisposition towards cynicism, then maybe these different philosophies can exacerbate that in a different way. So first, I want to talk about postmodernism because this is a term that people are really excited about now in terms of art and philosophy and society. And there's a lot of misconceptions about it, and it's not a very easy thing to understand. So one of my least favorite things about postmodernism to begin with, and I guess this isn't necessarily postmodernism, but just the way that it's discussed, is that usually if anybody criticizes postmodernism, the usual response is, oh, well, you just don't understand it. And that could be true. I think that there are a lot of people out there that don't really get a good grasp on exactly what postmodernism is supposed to be. And so they can come up with some different ideas that it just means anything that's weird or anything that's really strange or anything that breaks the rules. And again, I'm not too stringent about like enforcing the category of like what is postmodern or not. I think it's more interesting to discuss the content of a piece of art or a subject of discussion or investigation rather than trying to categorize it. But I think that a lot of the ideas within postmodernism are very interesting and helpful, and can relate to Buddhism in a way that not everybody usually expects. So more than anything, postmodernism can be used in different ways. And so sometimes it's used to refer to like an era that some people place as like beginning around World War II with the atom bomb and then ending around 9/11. But then other people think that it's more of a way to classify different pieces of art. And for example, like Don Quixote is sometimes considered a postmodern work, even though that was like well before that era. And I know that Ulysses by James Joyce is sometimes considered the first postmodern novel. Again, I really don't care too much about categorizing these things as postmodern or not. If you are really, really passionate about that, feel free to leave in the comments and like make that argument. But it's not very interesting to me personally. And it could even be the spirit of postmodernism that makes me not very interested in categorizing things in that way, because a lot of postmodern philosophy does have to do with the idea of categorizing and how categories are social constructs. And so I don't think I need to beat that point too much more. But one of the things that I think is definitive about postmodernism that I have gleaned from Derrida in the very little bit that I've understood of what I've read of him and different videos that I've seen on the internet is this idea of deference, or that meaning is deferred. And so an interesting way to think about that is I think of like, if you think of an object or a thing with a bunch of arrows pointing out of it, as if it's like pointing to other things to tell you what it is. And one of Derrida's central claims was the idea that since meaning is deferred and it has to point to other things in order to tell you what the thing is, we don't really have a very good concept of the thing. And so I've heard people describe this in different ways, that like if you look up a word in the dictionary, it just points to a bunch of other words. And then if you look up those words, it points to a bunch of other words too. So we don't ever really get a clear idea of what a thing is. And it points to the other things around it. It's deferred. And I think that there's a connotation of deferring too, is that one, it points to other things for its significance, but there's this idea almost as if it's like shirking its responsibility to define itself. And I think that this is pretty interesting for the ways that historically this has liberated people, because a lot of emancipatory politics have used postmodern philosophy. And I'm not really too sure on the history of this, if they were the activists were actually inspired by this philosophy, or if the philosophers were just describing what the activists were doing. But for example, different things like gender liberation and like the concept of what a man is and what a woman is, since meaning is deferred, and we sort of get the idea of what a man is based on what a woman is, and vice versa. You can see that this is very liberating for people that don't necessarily fit within the stable categories that we have imposed upon them through society. So again, or not again, but for the first time, this is not like a strict academic application of what postmodernism is. Like, you could comment if you'd like that Derrida didn't say anything like that, and it's not really my intention with this video to explicate what Derrida meant in his books. And I would actually challenge you to say with any confidence what you think he meant, because it is almost incomprehensible what he's going for. But I think that a lot of his ideas, at least as I interpret them, have a lot of sway outside of like an academic context. So I hope that I've explained that with some degree of rigor, at least for the purposes of today. But one of the more interesting things I think about postmodernism is that this spirit of deconstruction and of unmasking, which is a word that I got from a philosopher named Levi Bryant, who has some really good videos online. He's an object-oriented ontologist, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But he uses that term to unmask, I think, to maybe separate himself from this idea of deconstructing something. But it's the idea that, for example, to use gender once again, and actually he talks about bathrooms. He's quoting another philosopher in this case, but for example, it's like there's nothing inherent about a bathroom that makes it so that a man or a woman should go in one or the other, right? But we just put a category on front of them and say, all right, men go in this one and women go in this one. So this spirit of understanding that is arbitrary is unmasking that societal convention, that we have a convention that it seems to be normal, and it's so every day in almost every establishment. You can see gendered restrooms. That's changing quite a bit today, but there isn't really anything inherent that makes it that way. And how this relates to Buddhism, I think, is this concept of the no self. And what's nice about, I think, a lot of the Eastern traditions is that they can bypass a lot of the really complicated language that is more popular in the West, because it's not as strictly scientific. And I'm making broad generalizations here, obviously, but this is just these philosophies as I understand them. And in the Tao Te Ching in particular, I think gives a really good idea of this unmasking concepts and the idea of Derrida's deference, because they go through different concepts like tall and short, and that those define each other. And so again, I like to picture these stable concepts with little arrows that are pointing to each other. Like, oh, you think you know what tall is, but if we don't have a concept of short, we don't really know what tall is. And so they have like little arrows that it's like, oh, you want to know what tall is? Ask short. And then it's like, oh, you want to know what short is? Ask tall. And so I think a lot of times that this can be a little bit frustrating, or just maybe not very satisfying if we're just talking about concepts like that. of tall and short, because I don't think people really stay up at night thinking of like, well, what is tall after all, you know? But I think that's just an example of using a very simple concept in order to illustrate this concept of deference, or of unmasking traditional notions of how to make a stable category. But then you can extrapolate from that onto much more abstract things like the notion of a self. And so if you've ever read any Buddhist philosophy, or just casually looked on like YouTube and different things like that, the concept of the no self is extremely popular, but it's a little difficult sometimes to understand what is meant by that, because within the concept of the no self, it's not clear if it's supposed to be like an attitude or if it's like an actual claim. And as far as I understand, based on at least this book called What the Buddha Taught, where I'm getting most of my information from this, the concept of the no self is actually like a truth claim. And this is something that's actually been supported by modern science now. And I know that Sam Harris is an extremely controversial figure, so if you don't want to hear it from him, you can hear it from some different people. But he actually has a lot of good information on how the self is illusory. And since he's an atheist, I think he's really interesting to listen to on this topic in particular, because, he doesn't really indulge in a lot of flowery language or anything that you're supposed to take on faith or poetics or anything like that. He really tries to boil it down to a truth claim that there is no self. And within this book, anyway, just to get off of Sam Harris, they discuss that this illusion of the self is something that is actually these 5 aggregates of sensation. And so I'm just going to read this really briefly. That it says, what we call a being or an individual or I, according to Buddhist philosophy, is only a combination of ever-changing physical and mental forces or energies, which may be divided into 5 groups or aggregates. The Buddha says in short, these 5 aggregates of attachment are dukkha. Okay, I don't need to keep reading that. But basically, these aggregates of sensation have to do with different things like our faculties of eye, ear, nose, tongue, and body. So like our sensory perceptions that are interpreting the world. Then there are different sensations, such as like pleasant feelings, bad feelings, and things like that. And then we've got the aggregate of perceptions, and apparently there's 6 different kinds within that aggregate. But I'm not going to go into this too much, because explicating the text of this book is not really the purpose of this video. It's mostly the point that the idea of the no self actually is a truth claim about how you experience the feeling that you have a self, but it doesn't necessarily exist, at least according to Buddhist philosophy, and then a lot of modern science as well, that it really just is these different perceptions that you have at any given time. And I think that this is so interesting because these ideas are so old within Buddhism and Eastern traditions. And then I believe Derrida was writing like in the 1960s, and a lot of the other postmodern writers were writing at that time. So that's not to say that there was no other point in the Western tradition where people haven't posited this. I am not an expert on these ideas, especially on anything before the 20th century, and even in the 20th century for that matter. But I just like it that it's like our best minds came up with it like thousands of years after people had already been discussing these things. And what's interesting is that postmodernism and Buddhism are both supposed to be like liberatory. They're supposed to be used for liberation in different ways. And so like the postmodernism is usually different ways of unmasking and deconstructing traditional notions of either understanding a self or an identity in terms of power structures, or how dominant narratives are used to oppress people and how we can unmask those narratives in order to achieve liberation. And then in Buddhist thought, it's the idea of deconstructing these notions of yourself in order to escape the cycle of suffering. And so they're obviously coming from completely different historical backgrounds, but then they are still sort of after the same thing, which is to liberate individuals in different ways. One comes from a more political perspective and an ideological perspective, and then one is from a more like experiential perspective of how to not be suffering all of the time. And so what's interesting about these things, though, is that I think that they can lead to cynicism in unexpected ways, or that they can trick you into thinking that you have exposed the truth while you're really just sustaining negativity within your life and using cynicism as a defense mechanism. And so, for example, and before I get into all this too, I want to be clear that it's possible that all of these things are just misapplications of these philosophies. I'm not trying to say, again, that postmodernism makes you cynical, or Buddhism makes you cynical, or anything like that. But if you are cynical, or if you have predispositions toward that, either through misinterpretation or anything else, you can end up becoming cynical while thinking that you're exposing the truth. And I think that that's like the common response that a lot of people say when you're a pessimist, and then people criticize you being a pessimist, and you're like, no, I'm just being real. That's just what I am. And so I think that the way that it can do this is that it sort of like unmasks the actual experiential way that you have to live your life every single day. And so, like, in a grand sense, by dismantling all concepts and by having no stability within the things that you believe in, it can basically lead to this sort of generalized thinking that everything is a wash, that there is no meaning in anything. And I think that this is something that I've definitely fallen into in different ways, that was sort of, hidden behind the idea of intellectualism, that it's like, oh, I read these tough books and everything like that, and I get that concepts are not stable and categories are socially imposed. And then it almost leads to this kind of cause of despair, because on some level you still want that stability, but it's not there. And so it's like, wake up, this is the real world. Nothing means anything. And I think that to despair when you know that nothing means anything is almost to like implicitly assert that there is a meaning that you were denied, that you were supposed to have some sort of meaning, but the truth showed you that there was no meaning there. So you're mourning this lost meaning that wasn't there. And the same can be said for Buddhism, is that it's by dismantling this notion of the self, that's a really good way to deny yourself. It's like, well, I don't exist anyway, so like, what difference does it make if people are shitty to me and I never stick up for myself? It's like, there's no self to stick up for, right? And I think Zizek is somebody that's talked about that too, because a lot of times people say that Buddhism is the one religion that's been safe, and all the other ones have oppressive tendencies. But he talked about how there was like an army that used the concept of the no self to get people to fight, basically. That it's like, hey, if you don't have a self, then it doesn't matter if you die, right? So obviously these ideas can be manipulated in different ways. So just to clarify for the billionth time, I don't think that these are necessary extensions of these ideas, but they purport to be these things that unmask the truth, but you can very easily let them lead you into cynical thinking, and that nothing means anything. And that does sort of put me in a position now in this video to be like, well, what then? What then? Because we know that these traditional notions of making categories are false, and that this concept of the self is just an illusion. And so what then? And so, to be perfectly honest, I have no idea. I really don't know. I can point to different things that I've read before. For example, like I really got a lot out of the book The Undiscovered Self by Carl Jung, and his response to scientific rationalism, which he thought was the big ideological enemy of his time, in addition to communism, was that you need to develop like a radical spiritual interior. And so I think I'm too young to have done that to the point that I can be like, oh yeah, he was right, and then after that everything was great. So I definitely don't have answers in this regard, but I think what's interesting is, if I can try to summarize a little bit so this video doesn't get too long, is that these notions of unmasking the truth about everything can really bleed over into your thinking to justify you doing cynical things and avoiding your responsibilities in a different way. So let me give you an example, is that I started going to therapy again maybe a month or so ago over the phone. So shout out to therapy. It's very good. Even if you don't think you have anything to work on, if you can afford it, it's definitely extremely helpful just to like talk about you with another human. Whereas like usually there's an expectation if you're like complaining about your life to a friend, then they're like waiting so then they can, they're like, okay, now it's my turn. Whereas like with a therapist, they're just like, all right, we're here to talk about you and to see how you might be getting in the way of some of your problems, or getting in the way of solving some of your problems. And so one of the things that came up when I was in therapy was that I am cynical, and this was extremely surprising. And this is something that I've heard comes up a lot in therapy, is that you go in for one thing and then they tell you what's going on and you're like, but I didn't even come in here for that. I came in here for something totally different. And so that was definitely a surprise to me. But I think that it wasn't that by reading these things I became cynical, but I was using the idea that categories didn't mean anything to avoid taking a stronger interest in politics. I think that it's almost like the really poor man's version of postmodernism told me that just everybody in power is just like a power hungry person who can't be trusted. And so like, why should I have to learn about the political landscape if it's all a wash, And so I think that's a perfect example of me using these ideas in order to justify my disinterest and inaction on things, because it's like why vote if we just know that these are self-interested people that are just going to lie to us to get what they want. And then two, even with the Buddhism thing, is that it's like it's this spiritual practice that I think I was using to basically not really get what I really want, and to deny when bad things or bad emotions come up, that there are negative emotions there, and they'd be like, well, the self is arbitrary, so it's like, is that emotion even real? And again, this wasn't like a strictly logical thing that I was thinking in my head, but it was a pattern of behavior of thought that I had fallen into that had disguised itself as this intellectual or spiritual activity to justify those behaviors in a bad way. And so I'm going to leave you with one more thing, because this video is getting a little long anyway, but shortly after discovering that I was cynical in therapy, I told this to some of my friends, and they were like, oh yeah, Danny, I could have told you that. And I was like, oh, okay, so that must be true. And it was shortly before Super Tuesday, living here in California, and one of my friends was really trying to get me to vote, and I was just like, what's the point? This is stupid, this is dumb. And I went to bed, and I had a very evocative dream that I was in a bus that was being driven by this man, and I was letting him do all of the driving. And what was interesting is this bus was halfway submerged in water, so that the windshield of the bus was like halfway above the water, and then there was obviously water beneath the surface of the water. And I checked in on him, and I was like, hey, are you sure it's okay that this bus is in the water like this? And he was like, oh yeah, don't worry about it. Like, we're totally fine. So I was like, all right, I'll let him drive the bus. And so then, for whatever reason, in the logic of the dream, the bus was like tall. And so I went down into the bus where there was more air. And I was presumably sleeping in the dream. And then I came back up again to check on him if he was okay driving in this circumstance. And it turned out that the bus had completely gone underwater. And then in the dream, I had this feeling that I couldn't breathe anymore because I had come up to the surface and let somebody else drive for me. And he actually had put on a gas mask. And it was also around the time when more of the news about the coronavirus was breaking out too. And so I think maybe some of that might have influenced the face mask thing. And I asked him again, it's like, are you sure that this is okay? Like, this really doesn't seem to be okay. But he was like, oh, we're fine. Don't worry about it. And then once again, I went down into the bus to go get some more air because I couldn't breathe anymore. And I went to sleep again in the dream. And then when I woke up again, all of these people were pushing past me in order to get to the bus driver to stop him because I wasn't going to do it. And I was like suffocating in the dream, and then I woke up and I like wrote the whole thing down. And so to me, this was like a very powerful example of how I had been kind of living on autopilot and just sort of trying to self-comfort by not really engaging and being emotionally distant and letting cynicism and indifference literally drive my life. And when all of these people were pushing past me, there was this sense in the dream that I was letting them down in some way. That by me not driving the bus, it wasn't just affecting me. It was, I was like an individual that was connected to all of these other people that was somehow letting them down by not driving the bus myself. And so I have no idea if this will help you write better stories or not, but thanks for watching.